Henry, the big one. This is the one that I put off making for the longest time because I knew he would be the most difficult to make. And I've also sort of put off uploading this video as well, so go figure. We'll just be talking about new shape Henry today. We'll talk about old shape Henry in another video, but this is how I made him. Enjoy. Henry's new shape is famously based off the LMS Black 5. He's sort of the only engine that's really clearly one class of engine without any sort of modifications. So in that sense, it was really clear how I would make him. Like, I knew I was making a Black 5. It's not like some of the other characters where they're sort of a combination of a couple of different engines and you can sort of put your own interpretation on that. Henry is clear as day, no arguments, just a straight up normal Black 5, except he's green. So as with my other Railway Series style customs, I made this Photoshop that pretty accurately replicated the Black 5 look. I knew I needed to raise his footplate, extend his firebox, and give him a stannier tender. Going into it, there were two things I knew I really wanted to do. Firstly, I wanted to use the plastic of his original footplate when redesigning him. I'd made footplates from scratch before, like Barry's, and I didn't really like how this turned out. In particular, I didn't like the frayed edge of the cardstock. I knew if I used the plastic from the toy, it would have that smooth finish and match the rest of the engine. This would mean I'd need to cut off the footplate and reattach it higher up. The other thing was that I wanted the footplate to remain disconnected from the body, like as a separate piece as the classic Tomy engines were. I did not want to go through the same ordeal I went through with James, where it was all one piece, so I had to mask everything off with tape when it came to painting. Did I fulfill either of these goals? No. No, I did not. I tried to figure out how I could use his footplate, but it was too fiddly given the gaps for his wheels. I tried to fill the gaps with cardstock and putty, but it felt like a lot of extra effort for very little gain. It was also really difficult to figure out where and how everything would slot together because I didn't want to permanently glue the running board to the body. So in the end, I opted to use balsa wood that I cut to shape and that could slot in next to the boiler. I glued it on at just the right height so it gave clearance for the wheels to spin. To make sure that the footplate still had a smooth plastic look, I coated the wood in a thin layer of putty with a knife, like buttering on a very thin layer on some bread. I used lots of putty in the step of the footplate to make the pieces look seamless. This was actually incredibly difficult because it was so hard to sand down in such a narrow space and maintain a sharp right angle of the step. I would often undercoat the body so it was all one colour so I could see any egregious looking bumps. Eventually I got to a point where I was happy with it. I realised on Black 5s the step of the footplate sits further back than it does on the merchandise. I accounted for this when redesigning the footplate, which meant I had to cut off his piston valves so they could be reattached further back along the running board. This meant they somewhat covered up his front wheels, so I needed to cut away some of the plastic so that the wheels could still spin. It also meant that his regular side rods were too long, so I flirted with the idea of using these standard side rods, or even these unique ones that come with the Play-Rail redesigned Gordon. In the end, I just shortened his original side rods so they didn't push against the running board. I tested how far back I could cut it down so that it would still rotate properly within the valve gear, and I marked those points off with a texter, and then I cut it down to size. Because the piston valve moved backwards, I had to make it slightly larger. I did this with a bit of cardstock and putty. I actually painted the piston valve separately so I wouldn't overcomplicate things when it came to spray painting, but that didn't really end up going so well. We'll get to that later. Because the footplate moved so high up, the motor underneath was very exposed. So as with my other engines, I painted the motor and the underside of the body with Humbrol enamel matte black paint. I love the look of the fully exposed wheels. As with James and Gordon, I used cardstock and putty to extend his firebox. It took a lot of sanding down until it was all smooth. I tend to use 2 grades of sandpaper. I have a very rough grade that I use to file down large bumps, and then I transition to a much lighter grade for the final touch-ups and to give it a smooth finish. Before that though, I cut off his dome and reattached it further along his boiler. I used putty and sandpaper to smooth it over. I also cut out his cab using my Dremel tool. For quite a while I was stuck on how I would make his smokebox saddles. In the TV series and in the merchandise, they are triangular in shape. However, Black 5s have more cylindrical saddles, and thus there's a gap between them and the smokebox. I considered using the shaft of an old paintbrush or a thin straw, but then I discovered I could use the plastic tubes that come with new paintbrushes that protect the bristles from being warped or damaged. I cut them to the appropriate length and glued them on with balsa wood glue. This is the glue that I use for everything, even though it's not really meant for plastic. To be honest, I ought to get a better glue, but sometimes it's just easier to stick with what you know. One time I was buying glue at the hobby store, and the lady there was asking what I was gluing, and I said plastic models, and she was like, oh, you should really get this other glue, specifically this glue for plastics, because it melts the plastic slightly, so then they dry, like fused together. And I was like, no thanks, that's fine, I'll just get my normal glue. And yeah, she seemed really annoyed. Like, come on man, you're using the wrong glue, you should be using this other glue. Anyway, I probably should have listened to her because this glue peels off enamel paint and often leaves really ugly marks around where the glue has been placed. I tried attaching this pipe to Henry like the ones on real Black 5s, and it really messed up the finish on him. I was absolutely spewing. I tried my best to sand down the bumps, but moral of the story is I really should have listened to that lady from Metro Hobbies. Since then I've bought some more appropriate plastic glue that is much thinner, and it has a brush for application rather than coming out of a tube. I also used one of those cylindrical weights that sits inside Tomy engines to build that cylindrical tank that sits on the footplate. However, I didn't end up adding that to the model. I didn't want Henry to be overly detailed when most of my other engines are ultimately pretty simplistic. As I mentioned in my Gordon video, I used the chassis from Gordon's tender with Henry, since I used a spare troublesome truck chassis for Gordon's tender. For some reason, Henry's tender in the show is a very strange shape and looks very blockish without the black band at the bottom. I cut away at the bottom of the tender so it didn't sit so high up, and it managed to slot in quite nicely on Gordon's tender chassis. Strangely, the slots for the axles on Gordon's chassis didn't quite line up with where Henry's wheels sat. I had to carve some extra space at the front to widen the axle slot so everything could fit in nicely. You can't really tell that the wheels are slightly forward than where they should be. I used my Dremel to carve the back of the tender to give it the classic Stanier shape, and then I used blocks of balsa wood, cardstock and putty to fill in the top of the tender, sanding it all down until it was smooth. Making the tender this shape meant that a C-sized battery can no longer fit inside, so I placed some wooden blocks inside the tender so that a AA battery sits in there comfortably. I made a custom buffer beam out of cardstock and used some spare buffers from a truck. I glued on an old plastic straw to house the tender's back coupling. I cut the coal mould for the tender so it could fit into the new dimensions. Once I started painting him, I realised I'd forgotten to give him lamp irons. This is something I've done with all of my engines who have moulded lamps, like Barry, Big City Engine and Thomas. I cut them off and replaced them with lamp irons so I can change their head codes dependent on their train. For this I used the ends of those little plastic sticks that kept Trackmaster merchandise in their packaging. Then came the painting. First, I sprayed him Tamiya Gloss Black for his smokebox and cab roof. Then I masked them off with tape and sprayed him Tamiya Bright Red for the buffer beams. Then I masked off the red sections and sprayed him Aussie Export Matte Black for the running board. Lastly, I had to mask off everything that wouldn't be green. I had to very carefully mask around his smokebox saddles because they would be painted green. I would wait multiple days before applying the masking tape because I didn't want the tape to peel off any freshly sprayed paint. For the cheaper Aussie Export brand, I would sometimes wait a week before masking because it's lower quality paint, so it doesn't stick quite as well. I used Tamiya Park Green for Henry, the same shade I used for Percy and Daisy. After it was all complete, I filmed myself doing the final reveal. I won't put the whole thing on here, but if you are after some Thomas related ASMR content, link is in the description. Very sticky. There were some spots that needed touching up, which I did with hand paints. Same with my other tender engines, I hand painted the lining on his body with Humbrol bright red and used dark red Posca markers for the tender lining. After painting, it was the usual process of adding numbers and builder's plates with paper and a glue stick, and using masking tape for his cab windows. I saw a comment or two on my original Henry showcase video that the middle wheel looked sort of stupid because it was so floppy. I understand that. I've since added a small block of balsa wood behind the wheels to keep them from flopping around on the axle so much. And that's how I made Henry. I always assumed this one would be the most popular of all of my Railway Series style customs because it's such a drastic change from the toys, and also because Henry as a Black 5 is so iconic. I am really proud of how he turned out. I've always really loved the look of the fully exposed wheels without any splashes. I think it makes him look so powerful. Just makes me want to do a Super Rescue remake. The most remade story ever, but everyone's got to give it a go, right? Thanks so much for watching. Next up, we're going to be talking about Old Shape Henry. It was a really fun one to make and to conceptualize as well. It was a lot more creative of an exercise than New Shape Henry, who is just a Black 5. There's all the history around him being this engine of stolen design versus how he looks in the illustrations, which is quite simplistic. So there was a lot of different directions to go, and it was really fun to make him and to be a bit more creative with it. So yeah, stay tuned for that video, and until next time, have a good one.